Atrazine is a chlorinated triazine systemic herbicide that is used to selectively control annual grasses and broadleaf weeds before they emerge. Pesticide products containing atrazine are registered for use on several agricultural crops, with the highest use on field corn, sweet corn, sorghum, and sugarcane. Additionally, atrazine products are registered for use on wheat, macadamia nuts, and guava, as well as non-agricultural uses such as nursery and ornamental and turf. EPA's oversight of atrazine is dynamic and includes periodic reevaluation through the registration review process. Over the years, EPA has consulted with the FIFRA Scientific Advisory Panel on a variety of atrazine topics. Well, we'll come back to that at the end of this little review of what some of the science, the so-called basic science, as opposed to the applied science, that is the science that is simply trying to understand what is true, as opposed to being driven to develop a product or solve a problem that we know ourselves to have as humans. Some of the basic science has been for a long time warning of the dangers of atrazine. And in fact, enough so that we actually talked about it, and we recently responded to a question in a Q&A about this, but we actually talked about this briefly in our book, Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. I'm going to read this. Just one paragraph this is at the end of most of the chapters in our book, which came out in 2021. We have what we call the corrective lens. So given the subject of the chapter, in this case it's sex and gender, what might you do to help you resolve whatever issues you might have that stem from a hyper-novel modern environment and get yourself back into a state that is healthier and more productive? So one of our corrective lens points, finishing the sex and gender chapter in Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, is keep contaminants away from fetuses and children. In several species of frogs, there is an established relationship between exposure to common environmental contaminants like atrazine, an herbicide, and an increase in hermaphroditic individuals. While sex determination in frogs is different than in humans, we will not be surprised if it turns out that some of the modern confusion around sex and gender ends up attributable to widespread endocrine disruptors in our environment. And we have a footnote there, an endnote, pointing to two research papers published in 2002 and 1998, which I'm going to talk about a little bit here, which is one of the research papers is from the excellent Tyrone Hayes, a researcher out of, I think, Berkeley, if I remember correctly, who I was lucky enough to see at a conference sometime around then, late 90s, early aughts. He's an excellent scientist and also a very dynamic speaker, which always helps. And he was already on this drumbeat back in 2002. So here's the paper that we referenced in Hunter-Gatherer's Guide. Hayes et al., indeed he was at Berkeley, at least at the time. This is published in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which for those not in the know, if you care, you can tell that. I figured that because it was communicated by, in this case, David Wake. You have to be a member of the National Academy of Sciences to publish in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, or be recommended by someone who is, and they have a limited number of recommendations they can make per year. I don't remember what it is. But the title of this paper, published in 2002, is Hermaphroditic Demasculinized Frogs After Exposure to the Herbicide Atrazine at Low Ecologically Relevant Doses. And the paper is excellent. I'm not going to walk us through this in depth. There are a number of papers I just want to point to here. But that title says a lot of it right there. Atrazine, which we've already talked about what the EPA says it is, and it's on a majority of corn crops and many wheat crops and sugarcane as well. Not allowed to be on crops that are certified organic, but it spreads easily, as we shall learn, through the air, through the soil, and through water. And what we have is after exposure to atrazine at what they're calling low ecologically relevant doses, which is to say we had been told that you needed high exposure in order for it to make any difference, frogs are ending up hermaphroditic and demasculinized after such exposure. Now, as we say in Hunter-Gatherer's Guide, the mechanisms of sex determination in frogs are different from that in humans, but they too are vertebrates with two and only two sexes. And while while the mechanism by which what sex an individual frog is not, well, in some frogs it actually is, but it's a different origin of chromosomal sex determination in some cases, and it's a environmental sex determination in others. Still, it is logical to imagine that if other vertebrates are experiencing reproductive difficulties and endocrinological disruption after exposure to low doses of atrazine, that we too should be concerned about the effects on other vertebrates.
So I would just point out that there is a question here about the presumption of safety versus harm. And especially when you are dealing with a pesticide, you're dealing with something that is biologically active enough to disrupt an organism that is a threat to a crop. And what one hopes for, of course, is something that disrupts a mechanism that is so unique to the pest that it is not disruptive of other things in the environment and human health and physiology. But it's very hard to do that because biology is, we are all related, and biology is conservative. It builds on mechanisms that unite us. And of course, there are mechanisms that evolve after our split from a different clade. And you might occasionally happen on one of these things. But one should basically assume that something effective enough at disrupting pests has a likelihood of interacting with human physiology in ways that are unpredictable and may take a very long time to discover if you have a system that is immune to perverse incentives looking for the evidence that it either does or does not cause such a disruption.
Yes. And indeed, although the mechanism of sex determination is separately evolved in frogs and in humans, the pathways of masculinization and feminization and the hormones that are relevant in those pathways, everything from the androgens, including testosterone, androstenedione, and dione, to the estrogens and progesterone, oxytocin, the other steroid hormones, all of these things well predate the last time that frogs and humans had a most recent common ancestor. So there's plenty that is older than the most recent common ancestor of frogs and humans, even though the particular ways that it is determined whether individuals become male or female are different. Let me just show everyone a few more papers here. Next year, we have Hayes again, the Hayes lab out of Berkeley. Atrazine-induced hermaphroditism at 0.1 parts per billion in American leopard frogs, Ranipipians, laboratory and field evidence. And just the beginning of the abstract here, atrazine is the most commonly used herbicide in the United States and probably the world. Atrazine contamination is widespread and can be present in excess of 1 parts per billion, even in precipitation and in areas where it is not used. In the current study, we showed that atrazine exposure at greater than 0.1 parts per billion resulted in retarded gonadal development, that is gonadal dysgenesis, and testicular oogenesis, hermaphroditism, in leopard frogs. And slower developing males even experienced oocyte growth, phytogenesis. Okay, so that is reproductive chaos induced by atrazine at very, very low levels in the environment, even in places where it has never been applied in leopard frogs. Okay.
That's such an important and non-intuitive point, is that the degree to which these things atomize into the world and exist at very low levels, that is to say, you might not detect them, but that doesn't mean that a biological system will not be disrupted by them, because these biological systems are very sensitive to things that are designed to be disruptive in insects.
Exactly. So the other paper that we referenced in Hunter-Gatherer's Guide, in just like really a side comment about this, is Reeder et al. This was 1998, a few years earlier. Forms and prevalence of intersexuality and effects of environmental contaminants on sexuality in cricket frogs, Acris crepitans. So this is a different species, indeed a different family of frogs. These are hylids, these are tree frogs. And just here's here's one true thing. They say the process of sex determination and the influences on sex determination are not understood for this species. We are unaware of any reports that Acris crepitans experiences intersexuality or undergoes a sex reversal as a normal part of any of its life stages. Whereas they are finding, and they're specifically looking at PCBs and PCDFs, but they are finding intersexuality, general, again, reproductive chaos, and endocrine disruption as a result of exposure in very low amounts.
So I want to unpack a little bit of the expectation here, the evolutionary expectation. Mm-hmm. You've got plants, right? A biological clade that has an insect problem because plants are autotrophs. They take sunlight and they turn the carbon in the atmosphere into structural materials. Insects don't do this. So insects have to eat something. Many of them eat plants, right? It's one of the go-to things. And in order to eat plants, insects have to be able to withstand the poisons that plants introduce in order to prevent insects from eating them. So insects...
The so-called secondary compounds that plants put into themselves in order specifically to not be eaten.
Right. So secondary compound, if you're a biologist and you find a compound inside of a given plant and that compound doesn't do anything in the plant, it's not part of photosynthesis or respiration, if it's just existing there without obvious explanation, the explanation tends to be that it is a poison designed to disrupt the physiology of herbivores, especially insects, in order to reduce the amount of material lost to these parasites. So insects and plants have been involved in an arms race over this very thing since long before there were vertebrates. I think that's a fair statement.
Yes.
Yes. So the point is you should expect plants to create very effective toxins and insects to be very resistant to them, which is why it is hard to deal with pests with insecticides, because A, it's hard to come up with anything that overcomes the amazing architecture that insects have devised to detoxify this stuff. And if you do, they have an evolutionary preparedness to evolve past the whatever defense you have deployed. And so,
much as pathogens will tend to evolve out from under the killing effects of antibiotics, insects will, if possible, find a way to evolve out from under the killing effects of herbicides.
Right. So what you tend to end up doing, if you come up with an herbicide that actually works enough to be useful, it tends to be extremely toxic and highly complex, enough to defeat this system in insects. So at the point you've discovered something good enough to be an insecticide, you ought to be really worried about the safety of this stuff around other biological organisms.
Well, but luckily insects are an entirely different evolution of life, and therefore what affects them doesn't affect us. Would that were true.
Would that were true, which actually, there's an echo in here of Jordan Peterson's often misunderstood point about lobsters. His point is you've got a very ancient system that deals with serotonin, that this is a conserved molecular intermediary in a process that is old enough to go back, so that we find it in lobsters. And in this case, we find a lot of...
Serotonin turns out to be one of the oldest hormones that we know. And in fact, the most recent common ancestor of lobsters and humans both had serotonin.
Right. Yeah. So in any case, chemical insecticides are hard to produce. Why? Because the world has been engaged in an arms race between plants and insects forever, and that arms race prepares the insects very well. So yes, we have some ability to do stuff in a lab that plants have a hard time doing, but the ability to do something worth doing that is safe for other creatures is pretty minimal. And, again, bad enough if you have regulatory agencies that are completely free to discover the harm and forbid the use of stuff that's actually bad for people and the environment. If you have captured entities, then you're just at the mercy of companies who will make billions of dollars producing these molecules that are not safe for people because they do work on crops, and that's where we're going to find ourselves.
Yeah. Let's talk about the capture after we finish talking about the science.
Sure.
So this still from this Reader et al. Paper from 1998. So, and I include these older papers in part because that's what we cited, but also to indicate for how long research has been going on that is sending up the signal that says, beware, these are not as safe as we are being told they are, right? So a couple more pieces from the Reader et al. 1998 paper, which I have apparently subtitled, "They're Making the Frogs Militant." I see on my screen here for those who are carefully reading. Sex ratios of cricket frogs shortly after metamorphosis strongly favor females, as was the case at the control sites in Study B. However, at the sites contaminated by PCBs and PCDFs, there was a striking sex ratio reversal in juvenile cricket frogs, resulting in a high number of males. So, sex ratio reversal is a stunning result as that apparently is emerging after exposure to some of these environmental contaminants. And then feminization due to estrogenic and or anti-androgenic contaminants has been well documented in many species of vertebrates. And they've got, this is again from 1998, so these are all going to be older than 1998 references, and I'm going to scroll down and show us those. Various congeners, various congeners and mixtures of PCBs, PCDFs, and PCDDs possess a spectrum of estrogenic, anti-estrogenic, and anti-androgenic effects. We knew a lot of this a long time ago. Okay, so these references, and this is only a tiny bit of the references that are out there, but this very article cites include number 5, DDT-induced feminization of gull embryos. So that's from 1981. DDT, of course, famously is off the market, but most of these things aren't.
Off the market in the U.S. It is still used elsewhere.
Yeah. 20. Environmentally persistent alkyl phenolic compounds are estrogenic. That's from 1994. Synergistic activation of estrogen receptor with combinations of environmental chemicals from 1996. Reference 22, we have developmental abnormalities of the gonad and abnormal sex hormone concentrations in juvenile alligators from contaminated and control lakes in Florida from 1994. Reference 23, published in Nature, persistent DDT metabolite PPDDE is a potent androgen receptor agonist. And then we have just a few more, and this is again not exhaustive, from 1979, estrogenic properties of DDT and its analogs. We have factors affecting mammary tumor incidence in chlortriazine-treated female rats, hormonal properties, dosage, and animal strain. We have an ecological study of the cricket frog, 1984, diethylstilbestrol associated defects in murine genital tract development. That's mice. So now we're talking actually about mammals, from 1985, and in utero and lactational exposure of male rats to one of these toxins. And I think, and that paper is this, and it effects on spermatogenesis and reproductive capability. So many people will have heard tangentially or not so tangentially about lowering T levels, lowering fertility in men across the world, where, one of the sets of explanatory factors is right here.
So a couple more pieces of the sort of expected, go ahead.
And that research was published in 1992.
92.
Yeah.
As you say, we've known about this for a very long time.
Very long time. Researchers have been doing the research that shows that atrazine and several other chemicals, of which I have talked about a few here, definitely disrupt reproduction and endocrine systems in amphibians, at least. And furthermore, there's a lot of research about the persistence of, for instance, atrazine in soil and water. Here we have, let me make this a little bit bigger than you can show my screen here, Zach. Published in 2011, we have a Jablanowski et al. Paper called Still Present After All These Years, Persistence plus Potential Toxicity Raise Questions About the Use of Atrazine. The abstract reads, as one of the world's most heavily applied herbicides, atrazine is still a matter of controversy. Since it is regularly found in ground and drinking water, as well as in seawater and the ice of remote areas, it has become the subject of continuous concern due to its potential endocrine and carcinogenic activity. Current findings prove long-held suspicions that this compound persists for decades in soil. Due to the high amount applied annually all over the world, the soil burden of this compound is considered to be tremendous, representing a potential long-term threat to the environment. The persistence of chemicals such as atrazine has long been underestimated. Do we need to reconsider the environmental risk? So this paper, again, is published 12 years ago. And here are just a few more things from it. Additionally, recent evidence of endocrine disruption, activity of atrazine itself, and environmentally relevant concentrations is cause for serious concerns. In terms of a precautionary approach, we believe that the further use of atrazine should be halted or greatly curtailed. Atrazine and its metabolites can persist in water and soil for decades. Even more than 18 years after it was banned in Germany, atrazine remains the most abundant pesticide in groundwater samples. I think I have one more. Oh, no, that's it. Yeah, that's it for that paper. So we know it's disrupting endocrine systems in other vertebrates. We know it persists for decades after it has stopped being used in the soil and is found in seawater, in remote ice. So it is everywhere. And even in, for instance, Europe, which banned it a number of years ago, they still see it in their soil.